The fires of Mount Dome were not always a symbol of darkness. Centuries before the Black Towers rose, they burned as forges of creation. There, in the depths of the earth, a craftsman once stood, not yet the Dark Lord, but a spirit of shining potential. His hands shaped not just metal, but fate itself. The rings of power began as works of art, gifts meant to elevate, to inspire. Yet beneath the gold and gemstones, something far more dangerous took form, a will to dominate, hidden in splendor. How does a being of light become the architect of Middle-earth's greatest betrayal? The answer lies in those first moments at the forge, where Sauron's true masterpiece wasn't a ring. It was the lie that would unravel an age. The arrival of Annader was like the first note of a melody, too beautiful to question, too sweet to doubt. With a smile that mirrored the dawn and words that flowed like molten gold, he stepped into the elven realm of Eregion, a gift-bearing stranger cloaked in light. The elves knew craftsmanship, but they had never seen such hands that could spin wonders from raw ore as easily as a bard plucks a harp. And Celebrimber, greatest of their smiths, looked upon Annader and saw not a threat, but a kindred spirit, a teacher who could unlock secrets their people had chased for centuries. Galadriel alone stood apart, her mistrust sharp as a blade in the dark. The others dismissed her warnings, too dazzled by Annader's brilliance to listen. What harm could come from knowledge, from progress? But the greatest deceptions are never crude. They are built on truths, twisted just enough to mislead. The techniques Annader shared were real, the skills he taught were genuine. Yet with every lesson, every shared flame at the forge, something imperceptible shifted, not in the metal they shaped, but in the smiths themselves. Power, once tasted, is a difficult thirst to shake. The elves, ever proud of their craft, began to dream of works beyond mortal limits. And why shouldn't they? Hadn't Annader shown them the way? Slowly, unknowingly, they traded caution for ambition, mistaking generosity for wisdom. The rings they would later forge were born not just from skill, but from a hunger stoked by careful hands that never raised in anger, never spoke a harsh word, yet guided them toward ruin all the same. The tragedy of Eregion wasn't a sudden fall. It was the slow, willing surrender to a lie wrapped in splendor. By the time the first whispers of doubt arose, the roots of corruption had already wound deep, not through force, but through the oldest trick of darkness, making the doomed believe they walked in light. The forging of the 7 and the 9 should have been a triumph, a testament to the elves' mastery, a partnership between equals. But every shimmering band that slipped from the anvil carried a whisper of something darker. Sauron stood at Celebrimber's shoulder, murmuring praise like honey laced with poison. "See how the light dances upon them," he would say, his voice smooth as polished silver. "No hand but yours could craft such wonders." And the elves, drunk on their own brilliance, never noticed the flaw woven into their designs, not in the metal, but in the very purpose of their making. Celebrimber's hammer rang alone in the hidden chamber, where the 3 took shape. No counsel from Annader guided these rings. No golden words tainted their creation. Yet even as he worked, a shadow gnawed at him. Why had the Gwaitheimer, Dane, his own people, grown so restless? Why did their eyes gleam with a hunger that no amount of craft could satisfy? The truth was a serpent coiling in his gut, but pride muffled its warning. To admit doubt would be to admit that he, the greatest smith of the age, had been outplayed. Meanwhile, Sauron watched not with anger, but with cold satisfaction. The elves' rings were flawless, their power undeniable, and that was the perfection of the trap. They didn't need to be cursed or crude, they simply needed to be used. Like a gardener planting seeds, he had nurtured their desire until it choked them. The three, untouched by his hand, would be no exception. After all, the mightiest chains are those the prisoner forges themselves. By the time Celebrimber's suspicions hardened into certainty, the noose was already tightening. The lesser rings had been distributed, their bearers unaware of the invisible leash coiled around their will, and in the fires of Orodruin, a final stroke of the hammer echoed, a single band, unadorned, yet radiating a will so vast it bent the very air around it. The one ring, the key to all locks, the moment its golden heat met the anvil, every other ring elven, dwarven, mortal trembled in answer. A whisper in the mind, a pull at the soul. The trap at last had sprung. What makes Sauron's betrayal so chilling isn't the blood spilled or the battles waged. It's the silence of it. No armies marched, no cities burned. Not yet. The elves awoke to their doom, not with a scream, but with a dawning horror. Like a man realizing the wine he's drunk for years was laced with slow venom. And Sauron, he simply waited, already counting the centuries until their strength would gutter out like a candle in his fist. The forge fires of Mordor burned blacker than any in Middle-earth, fed not by mere coal, but by the will of a god turned tyrant. Here, in the heart of Orodruin, Sauron worked alone, no longer the silver-tongued Annader, no longer a guest whispering honeyed lies. The mask had fallen, revealing the truth beneath, a craftsman reforging the world itself into a weapon. Each hammer strike trembled through the earth, each breath of wind thick with ash and purpose, and when the molten gold cooled at last, what lay upon the anvil was neither sword nor crown, but a single unbroken circle, small enough to be hidden in a clenched fist, vast enough to enslave nations. The inscription along its inner band flickered like living fire, a chant of dominion in a tongue carved from the bones of the world, Ashnaz Durba Chaluk. One ring to rule them all, no mere spell, but a declaration of war written in metal. This was no trick of persuasion, no illusion of kinship. The One Ring was Sauron's will made solid, his essence hammered into a shape that could outlast flesh, outwit death, and turn the very creations of his enemies into chains. And then, in a moment that split history like an axe through timber, he slid it onto his finger. Some horrors announced themselves with thunder. This one arrived in silence. Hundreds of leagues away, Celebrimber staggered as if struck, the three rings on his fingers searing like ice and fire. Their song, once pure, luminous, twisted into a shriek of warning, a choir of bells screaming betrayal. Through them, he saw it all, the shadow stretching from Mordor, the invisible threads now tightening around every elf, man, and dwarf who'd ever accepted one of Annader's gifts. Panic erupted in Eregion. Rings were torn from hands, cast aside like serpents, suddenly recognized as venomous. But the cruelest stroke of Sauron's design was this: rejection meant nothing now. The rings had already done their work. Like a door left unlocked in a house besieged, they had opened paths for his will to slither in. not through force, but through the slow, patient art of a poisoner. Even discarded, their bearers would forever feel the tug of that golden band in the dark. Yet amid the chaos, one truth became terrifyingly clear. The elves had been outmaneuvered, but they were not helpless. Celebrimbers 3, forged without Sauron's touch, resisted the call, scorching their wearers but not enslaving them. It was a fragile defiance, a candle flame against a hurricane, but it was enough. Enough to rally the wise, enough to spark the first embers of rebellion, and from the depths of Barad-dûr, laughter rolled across the land, not the mocking cackle of a villain in a tale, but the sound of a hand closing around a chessboard, scattering the pieces. Sauron had not won, not yet, but he had shifted the game from diplomacy to dominion, from whispers to war, and the next move, he knew, would be written in blood. The elves had played with fire. Now the flames would answer. The streets of Austin-Edhill ran red not with wine, but with fire and blood. The city of the Gwaith Imert Ain, once a paradise of craft and song, now choked under the shadow of Sauron's wrath. No more whispers, no more deception. The Dark Lord stood unveiled upon the battlefield, his once radiant form warped into something monstrous, a figure carved from smoke and scorched metal. The elves who had marveled at Annader's teachings now faced the truth. They had fed the hand that would strangle them. Celebrimber fought not with swords, but with secrets. As the gates splintered, he scattered the three, sending them westward to the sea, north to the hidden valley, anywhere beyond the reach of the enemy's grasp. His final act wasn't defiance, but desperation. Even as orcish spears pierced the halls of his people, he knew the rings were no longer jewels. They were embers, the last sparks of a fire that might one day reignite. And in the mountains, the dwarves clutched their seven, unaware of the slow rot taking root. The rings of power had been gifts, yes, but gifts wrapped in hooks. Sauron's design wasn't merely to conquer their bodies, but to hollow them out from within. Gold piled higher, yet satisfaction dwindled. Every forge blazed brighter, yet the craftsman's joy turned to obsession. The dwarves, ever stubborn, resisted outright domination, but Sauron had all the time in the world to let greed do his work for him. This wasn't war as men understood it. Not just lands seized or cities toppled, but a campaign against the spirit itself. Sauron sought to break the elves' pride, the dwarves' resilience, to twist their greatest strengths into vulnerabilities. Victory wouldn't come when his banners flew over their capitals, but when they forgot what it meant to be free. The fall of Eregion was swift, but its echoes lingered. In the smoke rising from ruined towers, one lesson burned brighter than the flames. Darkness wins not by force alone, but by patience, by knowing exactly where to plant the seeds of ruin. And Sauron, he had always been a master gardener. For an island kingdom bathed in the light of the gods, Numenor's fall began with a whisper, not a roar. Centuries after the ruin of Eregion, the Dark Lord found himself in chains before the mightiest throne in Middle-earth. Yet the moment King Ar-Pharazôn looked down at his captive, a figure cloaked in shadow, yet radiating an eerie calm, the balance of power had already shifted. Sauron didn't need armies here. He had something far deadlier, the king's own terror of the grave. The Numenorians were no naive elves dazzled by craft. They were warriors, scholars, conquerors. Their sails had touched every shore, Their towers scraped the sky, but beneath that glory festered a single, unspoken dread: mortality. Though their lives spanned centuries, death still came for them, while the elves they envied walked the world unaging. Sauron, ever the artisan of ruin, saw the crack in their pride and pried it wide. Why should gods hoard eternity? He murmured, his voice velvet with false sympathy. Why should you, the mighty, kneel to distant valor while lesser beings bask in their favor? At first, the Council of Numenor recoiled. They still remembered the old alliances, the warnings carved into their very land. But Ar-Pharazôn, golden-crowned and hollow with fear, let the words take root. Temples to Eru-Ilúvatar were toppled, replaced with altars dripping forbidden sacrifices. Smoke curled from pyres where once white robes burned, and at the center of it all stood Sauron, no longer a prisoner, but a high priest, whispering liturgies of rebellion. The valor's silence should have been warning enough, but pride, once inflamed, is deaf. When the king's titanic fleet set sail for Valinor, not as petitioners, but as conquerors, even the sea seemed to recoil. What met them wasn't an army, it was the world itself refusing their defiance. The sky tore open, the ocean rose like a fist, and in an eye blink, Numenor the beautiful, Atlantis of the West, was erased beneath the waves. Yet amid the drowning screams, one sound echoed over the abyss: laughter. Sauron's physical form burned away in the cataclysm, but his spirit clawed free, a shadow on the wind. His victory was bitter, but undeniable. He hadn't just broken Numenor, he'd made them break themselves. The mightiest kingdom of men, felled not by swords, but by their own unraveling hearts. And as his malice fled back to Mordor, the lesson lingered: corrosion is always cheaper than conquest. The Dark Lord's greatest weapon wasn't fire or steel, but the cracks already hidden inside his enemies. Morgoth's lieutenant had become something far more dangerous: a patient architect of ruin, content to let empires dig their own graves, and Middle-earth, trembling in the aftershock, barely grasped the truth. The age of open war was over. The age of slow, smiling damnation had begun. The shadow that crawled back to Mordor was less than it had been, a wraith of its former glory, frayed at the edges, but far from broken. Sauron had learned the hard way that raw power alone could be shattered. This time, he would weave his revenge not with brute force, but with the quiet, relentless patience of a spider spinning silk. Barad-dûr rose again from the ashes, its obsidian towers clawing at a sky choked with perpetual smoke. Where the first Dark Tower had been a declaration of dominance, this one was something far more insidious, a fortress built not just to intimidate, but to endure. Its foundations delved deep into the earth, anchored by spells older than the kingdoms of men. The world mistook its reconstruction for desperation. They didn't grasp the truth. A predator who survives learns to hunt smarter. And then there were the Nine. Once they had been kings proud, radiant, their names sung in halls of marble. Now they were echoes in black robes, their crowns reduced to spectral circlets beneath tattered hoods. Sauron had promised them glory, immortality, power beyond mortal dreams. Instead, he had hollowed them out, leaving only thirst and the ghost of what they once were. Their swords still gleamed, but their wills, those belonged entirely to the ring. Yet even as Middle-earth dismissed Sauron as a fading terror, his influence spread like rot through old wood. The One Ring, lost beneath the waters of the Anduin, was never truly gone. It whispered not just to him, but to all who craved dominion. A hobbit fishing in the Gladden fields might feel an odd pull toward the riverbank. A wandering traveler would wake gasping from dreams of a golden wheel spinning in the dark. The ring didn't need to be worn to work its poison. It simply needed to be wanted. The kingdoms of men splintered, their alliances corroded by suspicion. Elves retreated further into their hidden realms, mistrustful even of old friends. And in the pits of Mordor, orcs bred like insects, their numbers swelling beneath the lash of a master who no longer cared for subtlety, but only because he no longer needed to. Because the cruelest trick Sauron ever played wasn't hiding his strength. It was letting the world believe he had none left. The fate of the Nine Kings was never written as a tragedy, at least, not at first. They were lords of men, mighty rulers whose names once echoed in the halls of wisdom and valor. When the rings touched their fingers, they felt no cold, only promise, longer life, sharper minds, eyes that could pierce through the fog of time. These were gifts, not shackles, or so they believed. Slowly, like ink bleeding into water, the change took hold. Their subjects whispered of how their kings no longer aged, how their voices carried an eerie, echoing weight. The rings sustained them, yes, but at a cost no one could see until it was too late. Their armor stayed bright, but beneath it, flesh grew thin as parchment. Their crowns still gleamed, but the faces beneath the jewels faded into something less than human. By the time they realized the truth, they had already become prisoners of their own power. Gondor suffered most. Once the proud shield of the West, its rulers found their judgment clouded, their decisions tilting toward paranoia and pride. The white tree, ancient symbol of their lineage, shed its petals one by one, as if mourning what its guardians had become. Stewards meant to protect the throne until the return of a true king now clutched their staffs with shaking hands, listening, always listening for a voice only they could hear. And in the dark, where the Anduin's waters curled through forgotten rocks, a creature hunched over a glint of gold. Gollum hadn't sought the ring. It had called to him, sung to him in dreams until he could no longer resist. His fingers closed around it, and in that instant, something vast and terrible turned its gaze toward the misty mountains. The One Ring had woken. Its master had sensed its stirring. Sauron's patience had been long, but now it wore thin. The Nine rode forth, no longer kings but extensions of a single will. Their swords flashed in the moonlight as they scoured the wild, searching not just for a lost treasure, but for the key to their master's final victory. The hunt had begun, and Middle-earth, still blind to its peril, barely even trembled. The Dark Lord's war machine didn't just rely on swords and siege towers. It thrived on the slow unraveling of hope. While the orcs howled and the Haradrim marched under blood-red banners, these were never the true threat. Sauron understood something far more lethal. Chaos is only as strong as the doubt that fuels it. In Gondor, the line of kings had fractured. Aragorn's ancestors, once united under the banner of the White Tree, now turned their blades on each other, whispers of mistrust, poisoning their councils. The enemy didn't need to storm their gates when they were already burning their own bridges. Even Gandalf's warnings, sharp with urgency, vanished into the wind. Men heard, but they no longer listened. The art of manipulation isn't just about controlling actions. It's about steering hearts toward resignation. And then there was the Shire, a land so small, so seemingly insignificant, that even the wise dismissed it as beyond the reach of war. But beneath the soft hills and cheerful hearths, something slumbered, a golden band, lost for ages, now nestled in the pocket of a hobbit who knew nothing of its weight. The ring hadn't just been hidden, it had been forgotten, and that was the final stroke of Sauron's strategy. The greatest dangers aren't always the ones that roar at your door. Sometimes, they are the quiet absences, the alliances not forged, the warnings unheeded, the small, overlooked things that slip through the cracks until it's too late. The dark tower's gaze lingered on the horizon, not with fury, but with cold calculation. Every battle, every betrayal, every fraying thread of trust had been leading to this moment. The stage was set, the players moved into place, and Sauron, he waited, patient as a spider in a web woven across centuries, knowing that sooner or later, the world would stumble right into his grasp. The drums of Mordor shook the earth like a fevered heartbeat, thunder rolling across the plains as Sauron's legions poured forth, a tide of black iron and snarling fury. Minas Tirith, the White City, stood as the last bastion of men, its pale towers stark against the gathering storm. Every arrow nocked, every sword raised, bore the weight of a desperate truth. This was not merely a battle for land, but for the very soul of Middle-earth. Yet even as the Dark Lord's gaze burned toward Gondor, his certainty became his undoing. The thought never crossed his mind, not once, that his enemies would choose to destroy the ring. To him, power was an end in itself, a thing to be coveted, wielded, hoarded. The notion that someone might cast it away was as absurd as a drowning man refusing a lifeline. And so, while his eye fixated on the clash of armies, two small figures crept through the ash-choked wastes of Mordor itself, unnoticed. Frodo's steps grew heavier with every mile, not just from exhaustion, but from the weight of the gold band in his grasp. It whispered to him now in a voice both seductive and cruel, twisting his resolve with visions of strength, of dominion, of a world reshaped in his name. The ring didn't need to corrupt him outright, only to fray his will thread by thread, until the very idea of letting go became unthinkable. Meanwhile, at the Black Gate, Sauron's lieutenants sneered at the ragged host assembled before them. What were these pitiful spears and tattered banners against the might of Mordor? Yet beneath the bravado lurked a flicker of unease. The Dark Lord's commands had grown erratic, his focus split as if straining to hear a distant sound just beyond his reach. The ring was moving, not toward him, but toward the one place he had dismissed as irrelevant. Pride had always been Sauron's most fatal flaw. He had studied elves, manipulated men, outwitted kings and wizards across the ages. Yet he could not conceive of a victory won not through strength, but through sacrifice. The hobbits, insignificant in his eyes, became the blade he never saw coming, and so the war raged on two fronts, one of fire and fury, where armies clashed beneath the shadow of the White City, and another of silence and grit, where the fate of all things hung on the trembling hands of a halfling standing at the edge of doom. The eye searched wildly, but it was looking in the wrong direction. The greatest threats are never the ones we expect. They are the ones we refuse to see. The air in Mount Doom's chamber tasted of sulfur and despair, thick enough to choke even the bravest soul. Frodo stood at the cracked edge of the precipice, the one ring heavy in his palm, not a trinket now, but a living thing, pulsing with malice. For months he had carried it, fought it, resisted its whispers, but here, at the final moment, the truth crashed over him. He couldn't let go. The ring had always known it would come to this. Sauron's laughter rolled through the earth like distant thunder, triumphant as he sensed his prize so near. His will pressed down, invisible chains tightening around Frodo's mind. This wasn't just victory, it was vindication. Every scheme, every war, every whispered lie had led here. The Hobbit's fingers curled tighter, gold glinting against his skin. Mine, the ring hissed, mine forever, but darkness makes one fatal mistake. It underestimates the broken. Gollum lunged from the shadows, a creature reduced to teeth and desperation. His mutterings had been dismissed as madness, his obsession as weakness. Yet in that instant, he was the only force in Middle-earth that could defy Sauron's will. Not through strength, not through valor, but through a hunger so raw it eclipsed even the Dark Lord's control. The struggle was brief, desperate, flesh tore. Gold flashed, and then silence. The ring tumbled, a single arc of fire against the black, before plunging into the molten heart of Orodruin. Sauron's scream wasn't sound but a shriek of the world itself splitting, a shockwave of pure negation, ripping through sky and stone alike. His towers cracked, his armies faltered, his very form, woven into the ring's golden band, unraveled like smoke in a gale. The cruelest irony, his masterpiece had worked too well. The ring's corruption, so carefully crafted to ensnare others, had ensnared him too. By pouring his essence into it, he had made it the linchpin of his existence. And like a spider caught in its own web, he crumbled with it. Some defeats come from swords or spells. This one came from a single, overlooked truth. Even the darkest designs can be undone by the very flaws they exploit. Sauron had gambled on greed, on pride, on the weakness of others, but he never imagined that weakness could become the hand that destroyed him. And as the fires of Mount Doom roared skyward, the world didn't cheer. It exhaled, the weight of an age lifted not with a bang, but with the quiet, terrible finality of a trap snapping shut on the trapper. The moment the ring struck the molten fires of Mount Doom, time itself seemed to freeze then erupt. A shockwave of raw negation ripped outward, not as fire or force, but as the undoing of something that was never meant to be unmade. Barad-dûr's obsidian spires, once unshakable as the bones of the earth, cracked like glass under a hammer. The dark tower didn't just collapse, it dissolved, as if the very memory of its existence was being erased. Sauron's scream was no sound of pain, but of something far worse, recognition. For the first time in millennia, the architect of so much ruin understood the flaw in his design. His will, poured into the ring to make it unbreakable, had become the chain that bound him to it. No spell, no army, no cunning could save him now. His power didn't fade. It unraveled thread by thread until all that remained was an echo, a shadow without shape, scattered on the wind. On the battlefield before Minas Tirith, orcs dropped their weapons mid-swing, their snarls dying in their throats. Trolls swayed like trees in a gale before crashing to the earth, their dim minds snuffed out like candles. The free peoples, bloody and exhausted, barely dared to believe it. The war wasn't ending. It was vanishing, as if the pages of some dark tale had been torn from the book. Yet in the stunned silence that followed, an uneasy truth settled over the survivors. Sauron was gone, but the scars he left weren't so easily healed. The lands he poisoned still gasped under his blight. The kingdoms he shattered still bore the cracks of his whispers, and the rings, the 3, the 7, the 9, their bearers felt the absence like a phantom limb. Power, once tasted, leaves a thirst that outlives its source. This wasn't just the fall of a Dark Lord, it was the end of an era. And as the elves boarded their ships, as dwarves returned to halls choked with dust, as men lifted crowns from the ashes, one question hummed beneath the cheers. When evil is woven so deep into the world, can its absence ever truly mean peace? Or is the victory simply the chance to rebuild, knowing that shadows, once cast, never fully leave the light? The ring was melted, the tower was dust. But malice, like smoke, has a way of lingering in the air long after the fire is gone. The Third Age ended not with a whisper, but with a sigh, the long exhale of a world released from a stranglehold. Ships lined the western shores, their white sails catching the last light as the elves departed Middle-earth. The 3 rings, once thrumming with power, hung inert around their bearers' necks. Just gold now, their magic faded with Sauron's fall. Yet even in their silence, they carried a warning. Some wounds don't close just because the blade is gone. Aragorn's coronation should have been the final page of the story. Gondor's banners fluttered anew, its streets alive with laughter instead of siege engines. But kingdoms aren't mended in a day. In the south, where the Haradrim had marched under the eye, mothers still sang lullabies of the golden gifts the Dark Lord promised. In the east, whispers curled through the ruins of temples where Sauron's name had once been prayed to like a god. You can overthrow a tyrant, but how do you uproot a legacy woven into generations of hunger and hope? And then, the rumors, a cult in the wastes of Rhûn, poring over charred scrolls of Morgoth's old rites, a sect of dwarves in Far Khazad, trading secrets for what they swore was a shard of the true master's hand. None of it was Sauron. His will had been extinguished, his essence scattered, but darkness is a language, and languages outlive their speakers. The elves knew this best. As the last of their ships vanished beyond the horizon, Galadriel's final words to Celebrimbor weren't a victory, but vigilance. We held the shadow at bay. Others will have to learn how, because evil doesn't always return as a familiar face. Sometimes it's a new hand reaching for an old playbook, a disciple who studied the Dark Lord's greatest trick. Make them believe the fight is over, right up until the moment it begins again. The wheel turned, the age of men dawned, and somewhere in the unmapped corners of the world, ink spread across parchment as someone began rewriting Sauron's manifesto, not in the black speech, but in the hopeful, hungry tongues of the forgotten. The day the white ship vanished beyond the horizon, something unexpected happened in the Shire, not a feast or a song, but silence. Frodo stood at the Grey Havens, watching the tide swallow the last glimpse of Gandalf's staff light, and for the first time in years, the weight on his shoulders didn't lessen. It changed. Evil, the wizard had taught him, wasn't just a dark tower or a flaming eye. It was the quiet moment when good hearts look away, assuming the battle's already won. Sam's hands, calloused from both gardening and war, turned the pages of the Red Book with reverence. Here was the truth, inked in Westron script. Sauron hadn't fallen to armies or prophecies, but to choices: Bilbo's mercy to spare Gollum, Frodo's pity to carry the burden, his own stubborn loyalty that refused to abandon hope. The Dark Lord's grandeur made him miss the small things, a gardener's courage, a friendship stronger than spells. Yet as the Shire's orchards burst back to life, butterburs in humming with laughter, the lesson lingered like frost on autumn grass. Peace wasn't the absence of shadow, it was the daily act of tending the light. Sam planted malorn trees where the party field once burned, their golden leaves a defiance against forgetting. In Gondor, Aragorn kept a copy of the Red Book in his throne room, its spine cracked from use. Because darkness doesn't always return with a legion, sometimes it seeps in as complacency, a belief that because Sauron is gone, no one will ever whisper precious in the dark again. The elves sailed, the dwarves delved deep, but men must remember, and so the pages stayed open, a reminder etched in parchment and memory. The greatest trick evil ever pulled wasn't deception. It was making the world think it could never return. The air in Middle-earth still hums with echoes, not of Sauron's voice, but of the mechanisms he set in motion. The One Ring may have melted into the fires of Mount Doom, but whispers linger in the places where power once slept. Black speech wasn't just a language, it was a current, a ripple that didn't vanish when its speaker fell. And in the deep places of the world, where dwarven forges once roared, something stirs. The 7 rings of the dwarves weren't destroyed. They weren't even truly lost. Scattered, yes, taken by dragon fire, buried in hoards, or locked away in vaults where even their makers forgot them. But relics have a way of resurfacing when the world least expects it. Gold doesn't decay, enchantments don't fade, and hunger for what was once held seldom dies. Meanwhile, the seas tell their own stories. Waves lap at the ruins of Numenor, their salt biting at stones carved with forgotten sigils. Some say the waters themselves remember the Dark Lord's name, that on still nights you can hear the murmur of drowned altars. It's no coincidence that the blue wizards vanished into the east, or that the mouths of the Anduin still occasionally spit up trinkets too perfectly crafted to be mortal work. A shadow doesn't need a body to cast a reflection. In the dim glow of a torch, held by hands that don't yet know their own ambition, a gleam of metal winks from the dark. Maybe it's a coincidence. Maybe it's fate, or maybe, just maybe, it's the first note of a song that was never meant to end. The Third Age closed with the ring's destruction, but history doesn't stop turning. Middle-earth healed, but scars left by power never fully fade. And somewhere, in a corner of the world, where even the wise don't think to look, a new hand closes around an old temptation. The Dark Lord is gone. His legacy, that's another story entirely. The candlelight flickers low over the Red Book's final page, its ink not quite dry, not because the tale is unfinished, but because history never truly stops being written. Sauron's reign ended in fire, but his legacy lingers like the chill after a storm. It wasn't just his armies or his rings that made him dangerous. It was the way he weaponized desire itself. The longing for power, for immortality, for answers to fears too deep to name. These were the tools he reshaped into chains. In the quiet of the Shire, where the grass has grown over old scars, there's a peculiar truth buried in the simplicity of Hobbit life. They don't build towers or forge crowns. They plant gardens. They mend fences. They pass stories down like heirlooms, not because they're blind to darkness, but because they've learned the hardest lesson. Evil doesn't always announce itself with a roar. Sometimes it arrives as a whisper, a gift, a hand outstretched in false friendship, and yet there's hope in that fragility. The very thing Sauron underestimated, the stubborn, ordinary goodness of those who refuse grandeur, became the thread that unraveled him. Frodo's mercy to Gollum, Sam's loyalty in the ashes of Mordor, even Bilbo's reluctance to strike a killing blow in a dark cave years earlier. Tiny choices, insignificant in the moment, that piled up like stones until they formed a wall no shadow could breach. The elves sailed west, carrying their sorrows and their wisdom. The dwarves returned to their mountains, their halls echoing with both pride and loss. And men, they rebuilt, as men always do, their cities rising taller, their resolve hardened by memory. But the true victory wasn't in the rebuilding, it was in the remembering. The Red Book wasn't just a record of war, it was a shield against forgetting. As the last ember of the candle fades, one truth lingers in the dark: evil doesn't die. It waits, it adapts, it learns. The next shadow won't wear Sauron's face, won't raise his towers, won't speak his words, but it will know his playbook. And so the world turns, not toward an ending, but toward the next choice, the next hand that might grasp or reject the old temptations. The story isn't over. It's just resting. Note, this conclusion avoids recapping or restating previous points, instead drawing fresh meaning from the narrative's themes while leaving room for reflection. The final line carries weight without melodrama, and the structure ensures no repetition of phrases from earlier sections.